Well, again, good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here with you today. You know, that first reading from 2 Maccabees is extraordinary, and it's one of the most dramatic scenes in the whole Old Testament. The setting, of course, is the period when the Greeks were imposing their culture on Israel. And there was a great resistance to it led by Judas Maccabeus, that means Judas the Hammer. Hence the book of Maccabees describes that period. And this particular scene is maybe the most dramatic described in the books of Maccabees. Namely, a mother with 7 sons, and they refuse to cooperate with the oppressors. They won't eat pork, in violation of Jewish law. And so this brutal persecution and this execution unfolds. One by one, the sons are brought in front of the mother on purpose. They're tortured, their hands and feet, limbs cut off, and then killed, till finally she's killed. Do you doubt this happens up and down the centuries, that religious people sometimes face a culture so inimical to them that it leads to martyrdom? Well, don't look too far. Our patron saint right here, I love how insouciantly he holds the axe that killed him. See, he's in God, he's beyond that suffering. But if you doubt that this happens to the present day, 20th century was the greatest century of martyrs in the history of the church. There were more martyrs in the 20th century than all the previous centuries combined. That's what happens when the culture is violently opposed to the faith. It happens. And people like that mother and the 7 sons, up and down the centuries, are great heroes in that resistance. Now, we're not at that point in our country, thank God. We're not. But and especially here in this college town, on a university campus, we know about opposition to the faith. Am I right? I do a lot of work on the internet, so I'm in dialogue all the time with the secular culture. And I know there's a lot of opposition, not to the point of death, thank God, but a lot of criticism. What's wrong with you religious people, with your medieval ideas, your cruelty and your obscurantism, and is it time to grow up and become good secular moderns, and right? So we do face, not brutal persecution, but persecution. And a lot of you in this room are on the front lines of it, right? Now here's the first insight I got for you. Don't be bullied by it. We in the great Catholic tradition, we're not in some little rowboat. We're on this great ocean liner of an intellectual and artistic and spiritual tradition. Some of the greatest figures, you got some up here, some of the greatest figures in the Western world, not just Western, all over the world, some of the greatest intellectual and cultural figures belong to our tradition. You want smarts? We got Thomas Aquinas. You want deep holiness? How about Mother Teresa of Calcutta? You want courage? How about Thomas More? You want a lot of those things combined. Look at John Paul II. Don't think for a minute that the secular culture is in some great, ocean liner and we're in some little rowboat. On the contrary. We speak out of a very rich and profound and beautiful tradition. More to it. And I come across this every day. A lot of people, skeptics, at least announcing themselves as skeptics, come on my website, full of angry questions. And I tease them sometimes. I'll say, well, nevertheless, you're on my website, right? Or they'll attack a sermon of mine, there's a bunch of medieval nonsense. And yet you're listening to my sermon. Just, remember in the Gospels when Herod, who had arrested and put John the Baptist in prison, nevertheless, Herod secretly listened as John the Baptist would preach in prison. There are a lot of people like that. And there's a very simple reason why. You find it on page 1 of St. Augustine's Confessions. And everybody in this room, especially the young people here, if you've not read Augustine's Confessions, read it. Start this afternoon. Get the translation, by the way, by Maria Balding. She was a Benedictine nun. She did a translation of Augustine that makes it read like a novel. No kidding. It's really engaging. Get her translation and start reading it. But page 1 of the Confessions contains the single greatest line in Christian anthropology, namely this: Lord, you've made us for yourself, and therefore our heart is restless until it rests in you. Notice he doesn't say our hearts are restless. He says our heart, cor nostrum, singular. Why? Because we all got it in common. Every one of us, everyone in this room, everyone in this world has in common a hunger and thirst for God. Why? Because we've been made for God. And that's why, fellow sinners, we all walk down this path, right? That's why nothing in this world finally satisfies the deepest longing. Give all the wealth you can get, all the pleasure you can acquire, all the honor you'd ever want to receive. Will it make you happy, capital H? Am I right? In fact, you go down that path, it'll lead to unhappiness and addiction. I mean, where's addiction come from? But I need more of this thing. That's why I'm not happy. I must need more pleasure. I must need more honor. I must need more power. And before I know it, I'm addicted to these worldly things. No. Cor nostrum in quietum est. Our heart is restless until it rests in God. And everybody deep down knows it. Which is why, again, we shouldn't be cowed when we speak of God. Take the example of the courage of the mother and the sons in that wonderful Maccabee story. That we should stand with courage in the face of that criticism. Say, no. We speak for what is deepest in the human heart. I've had this story before. I was in California up until I was assigned here to Winona, Rochester, and I used to go for a walk on the beach there, beautiful, on the Pacific Ocean. And there's a section where they let the dogs, off the leash. And these dogs, it would be with their master, and the master would throw the tennis ball out in the surf, and the dog would run out, and he'd grab the ball, and he'd run back, and that's an image of heaven if you want, because, see, that dog is totally, utterly happy. Because that's all the desire he's got. Well-fed, has a loving master, and is having a ball on the beach. That's all the dog wants, and so he's completely happy. But we're not like that. Because we can be well-fed, we can have a ball on the beach, we can have all the fun in the world, and then what? There's still that longing, because we're built for more than that. The world always needs to hear that lesson. Here's one more little take on this question of God and the longing for God. How many scientists are here? Who are studying the sciences? Good, like what, physics or chemistry or? Biology, okay, good. And what's this Mankato State famous for in terms of studies? Is it education or nursing? What is it? So nursing, of course, very much involved with the sciences. Something I find with a lot of young people is there's a great reverence for the sciences. Terrific. I love the sciences too. And you know what they gave us? One reason people reverence them so much. I got these two machines in my pocket, but like this thing that the sciences gave us, I mean, the technology that's made our lives so livable and easy. I can ask this lady, hey Siri, how many students are there at Mankato State?
Here's an answer from AmericanSchoolSearch.com. Minnesota State University, Mankato.
15,315. Okay. Thank you, Siri. All right, that's enough. No, it's stupid. I'm just making the point that the miracle, when I was a little kid, what I just did, that's out of Star Trek. They did that on, you know what I'm saying? What the sciences have produced for us, God bless them. But what's the danger? The danger is a kind of scientism that says the only thing we can know or worth knowing is what the sciences tell us. The reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge, it's an infection in our culture. And what it does to people's minds and hearts is it warps them and limits them and restricts them to this world only. Attend to the gospel. There's a lot more we can say about it, but the Sadducees who didn't believe in life after death, and they challenged Jesus with this kind of reductio ad absurdum argument, They were people who were limited to this world only. Oh, there are a lot of descendants of the Sadducees today. Scientism that limits our vision. But let me tease you with something here. What's the foundation for all the sciences? Whether it's biology, chemistry, psychology, astronomy, any of the sciences, what is it? Some sense that the world is imbued in every nook and cranny with intelligibility. Am I right? I mean, any scientist has to go out with the confidence that she will meet a world that's intelligible, that's knowable, that has a knowable structure to it. Whether you're looking up into the stars, you're looking down into the smallest microscopic reality, you're expecting to find something like order and intelligibility. Otherwise, your science wouldn't get off the ground. Albert Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. But think about it. See, we take it so for granted, we don't realize how deeply strange that is. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is it's comprehensible. Universally, in every nook and cranny, up, down, the biggest, the smallest. Why should that be true? Why should that be true? The great answer of our tradition is because the universe was made by a mathematician. The universe, imbued with intelligibility universally, was made by someone of infinite intelligence. The intelligibility of the world corresponding to a universal and infinite intelligence. Go get an article once you're finished with Augustine's Confessions. 1960, a man named Eugene Wigner. He was not a Catholic, he was a secular Jew. Physicist of the generation right after Einstein, so people like Niels Bohr and that generation. Eugene Wigner wrote an article in 1960, look it up on the web, and it's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. Now think about that title for a second. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences. His point was, in his physical science, physics, what did he find as he looked out? That the world could be described with the most extraordinarily complex mathematics. Why should that be true? Why should that be true? That we have to use the most complex mathematical formulas and equations to describe the nature of physical reality. Why wouldn't physical reality just be at a very basic or chaotic level? Why is it imbued through and through, up and down, great and small, with a mathematically refined intelligibility? Now, I say, Wigner was a secular Jew. He didn't say, oh, God is the answer, but he said, you know, it's a miracle. Read the article from a secular physicist. You know, it's a miracle, he says. Well, he's right. What I would say to those who, in a scientistic way, say, you know, there's no God, and this is silly, and there's just this world, it's just matter and energy. Yeah, but it isn't just matter and energy, is it? It's matter and energy patterned in highly complex mathematical ways. How do you explain that? How do you explain that? What both readings are doing, the first reading from Maccabees, second Maccabees, and the Gospel, in a way, they're trying to break us out of this soul-suffocating secularism. Excuse the alliteration, but the soul-suffocating secularism that is bedeviling a lot of people today, especially young people. You know, and you guys probably know this from just your talking to your friends and so on. Study after study after study have been showing how deeply unhappy younger people are. Surprising? I don't know. You take away the transcendent referent, you take away the sense of God, of ultimate purpose, of deepest meaning, all you got left are the goods that this world can give. You'll be superficially happy for a few minutes, but you're going to be unhappy at the deepest level of your soul. Why? Because, Lord, you made us for yourself, and therefore our heart is restless till it rests in thee. See, now everybody, in a few minutes at the end of Mass, I'm going to send you forth from this place. So here we are, and we're listening to the Word of God, and we're going to eat and drink the body and blood of Jesus Christ. We're going to be drawn into this intimate communion with the Trinitarian God. Terrific, terrific. But this is not meant just for us. Henri de Lubac said, the most sacred words of the Mass, after the words of consecration, are, go. Go. The Mass is ended. Go. Go out from this place. Where's mission country begin? Right out that door. Am I right? You don't got to get on a plane and fly to Asia or Africa or something to find mission country. It's right out that door. And we're meant to take the fire of this experience and bring it to all of these hungry hearts that are out there. They're your friends, they're your colleagues, they're maybe your teachers, your peers and parents. Let's not be cowed. No. Be like that mother in 2 Maccabees and the 7 sons. They were facing, murderous persecution. We're not facing that, thank God. But we are facing opposition. Summon their courage. Summon his courage, our patron saint right there. Summon his courage. And speak of God. Speak of God. Speak of God. Don't be cowed into silence. Don't think we're in some little pathetic minority. No. We're speaking from the mainstream of a powerful intellectual and cultural tradition. Be missionaries. I promise I'll end with this. I've been telling everybody in this diocese, my number one priority is vocations. We need priests, big time in this diocese. Our priests are shrinking in number. And I got a lot of priests about to retire. I got 2 years in a row, no ordinations in our diocese. This is not good. I'm looking out here. I'm looking up here, by the way. Priests, we need you. We need you. Now that's a powerful way to be a missionary, a powerful way to be a witness. By the way, our reader, what a great voice. There you are. Doesn't he? Talk about that guy should be proclaiming the gospel, I think. Young ladies, I'm not forgetting you, not for the priesthood, but I don't know if I wrote an article last week on Mother Alfred. She's the great Franciscan sister who basically founded the Mayo Clinic. Read up on her sometime. There's a lady of acute intelligence and confidence and moxie, and it told people what she wanted, and by God, she got it. And the Mayo Clinic, because she's the one that had the vision. Remember, the story. We should all know it and propagate it. That when she was helping the original Dr. Mayo with the hospital, taking care of some people, she said, yeah, we're meant to build a hospital here in Little Rochester. At the time, it was a little nothing town. But she said, not just for Rochester. It's meant to take care of the whole world. And everybody around her thought she was out of her mind. Where are you getting this idea from? Well, she did it, by God. She built the hospital that indeed now is serving the whole world. Young ladies, religious life, we need you. We need you. So, all of us, let's summon the courage of that great mother and the 7 sons in 2 Maccabees. Let's summon the courage to announce God to a hungry world. When you're the ordinary, now you're the one who sets the tone and provides the vision. From a kind of real practical standpoint, the buck stops with you. So you're the one that has to make the final decisions. I put it in spiritual terms that you're the father of that diocese. So I'm a bishop of this diocese in Los Angeles, but I'm not the spiritual father of the archdiocese. Jose Gomez is. But now in Winona, Rochester, I'm the spiritual father of the roughly 140,000 Catholics who are there.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. It's an exciting time at Word on Fire because Pope Francis has just appointed Bishop Barron to be the next bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester. We're going to talk about that today, when Bishop Barron found out about it, how the process works, what he's looking forward to in his new diocese. So welcome, new bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester.
Well, thanks, Brandon. Always good to be with you. And yeah, it is an interesting, exciting time for me.
Before we get to this exciting news, let's update everyone on what you've been up to. You recently got back from New York. You took a trip there to do a Word on Fire event, and then you got to play golf at a pretty prestigious golf course. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the wonderful guy, Brian McAuliffe, who sponsored this fundraiser, is a member at Winged Foot, which is it's north of Manhattan. It's like just past New Rochelle. That's where the seminary is, Dunwoody Seminary. I've been there before. But Winged Foot's one of the most famous golf courses in the country. They've had, U.S. Opens and all kinds of big tournaments there. So I got the privilege of playing on that course. And, if you're a golf fan, as I am, to be on sort of that sacred ground is terrific. And I found the course, tee to green, to be fairly playable, but man, they were the toughest green complexes I've ever played. Meaning the greens themselves, they were almost all slanted severely back to front, but then also with all kinds of undulations, and then severely fast. So, for an amateur like me, I might not be on the green in 2 shots the way the pros are. I might be near the green. So I have to pop a little approach shot up, and I'd hit these shots. I think, oh, that was a good shot. That's exactly the way I wanted to hit it. And I come up to the green, and it's 35 feet off the back of the green because it just wouldn't hold, And I hit a putt, and I think, okay, that's about the right pace. I look up, and it's 25 feet beyond the hole. So it was pretty challenging to play at the greens, but I loved it. It was a great experience.
Well, golf is a good connection to today's topic because I think it was back in 2015 when Pope Francis appointed you to your current position as Auxiliary Bishop of Los Angeles. I believe you were watching golf when this phone call came through. It's a mysterious process to those of us who aren't in the hierarchy. How does this come about? How do you find out that you're a new bishop?
You remember, I'm sure, Brandon, I was with you and your family. You guys were in Chicago. I'm kind of forgetting why exactly, but you'd come to Mass. We had gone out with one of our great donor friends, Ernie Wad. And then I came back from that lunch. And I was kind of worn out. It was, the Mass and all the activity and the lunch. And I'm back home, and I just, had my shorts and T-shirt on. I was lying on the couch watching golf. And this phone call comes, and it changes your life completely. At that time, it was, the Holy Father's appointed you Auxiliary Bishop of Los Angeles, which was an utter surprise. This time around, it was also on a Sunday, which is curious to me. I had just gotten back from Kansas, right? I had the great privilege of speaking at the Benedictine College graduation. So that was a long haul, though. I had to fly there, and then I flew back through Denver, and then to LA, and then back to Santa Barbara. I didn't get back till midnight on Saturday. And then the next morning, because of that trip, I didn't have a Mass out in the parishes anyplace. So I woke up, and I just had Mass in my private chapel. Went to the kitchen, made my scrambled eggs, and I sat down at the table, and I had my phone just sitting there, and it comes up with this 202 number, which is Washington. I knew that. I thought, who is calling me from Washington? And this was 8:30 in the morning, maybe. And who's calling me from Washington? So I pick up the phone, and it's Archbishop Pierre, the Apostolic Nuncio. So I kind of knew at that point. And then what they do, he just said to me, is this Bishop Barron? And I said, yes. And he said, the Holy Father's appointed you the new Bishop of Winona, Rochester. And just like that, it's not, they don't really ask you, are you willing to do this? Even though, you can refuse. But it's presented to you as kind of a done deal, like the Holy Father has done this. So, I've always preached, your life's not about you, and when the church calls, you say yes. And, when I was a young kid, I put my hands like this in the hands of Joseph Bernardine, who ordained me to the priesthood. And I said, I promise obedience to you and your successors. And that's what I did, as long as I was obeying one of his successors in Chicago. And then the big boss comes in, the Pope, and says, I want you to do this. So you do it, end of argument. And I'm fine with that. I think that's great. You do what the church wants you to do, and you trust the Holy Spirit is involved. So, just joyfully and automatically, I said, okay. That's how it happens.
Now, when the Apostolic Nuncio mentions Winona, Rochester, were you already familiar with that diocese? What'd you know about it at that point?
Yeah, a little bit, not a lot. I knew it from, go way back to my friend John Vlasny. John Vlasny was a Chicago priest, and I, as a young kid, as a seminarian, I spent a summer as an intern with him, so I came to know him. And then shortly thereafter, he became an auxiliary bishop of Chicago, and then he was made bishop of Winona. So that's how I knew it, was through John Vlasny. But also, I should actually go back a little bit earlier. My mother's brother, my uncle, was a Christian brother, a De La Salle Christian brother. And he taught all over the Christian brother world. But one of the places that they taught, they're still there, is St. Mary's College, Winona. It's now St. Mary's University. So I knew it from him as well, from my uncle. And then when I was at Mundelein as a professor, I went up on a couple of recruiting trips because there's a college seminary still there, still flourishing, called IHM College Seminary, run by the diocese. So now I'm excited. That's my seminary now. And I did recruiting trips up there. So I knew it a little bit from these connections, but I still am not, really well acquainted with it. I'm in that process now.
It's notable to me that with this new appointment, you've now been appointed twice as bishop by Pope Francis. So he made you the auxiliary bishop in Los Angeles. Now he's appointed you bishop of Winona, Rochester. That puts you on a pretty short list of people that have received 2 appointments. Do you find that encouraging?
Yeah, and it's interesting, because I think you're right, Brandon, that it'd be a relative handful of people in our country who've been appointed bishop twice by Pope Francis. I think of my friend Ron Hicks, who was made an auxiliary in Chicago, then made Bishop of Joliet by Francis. I think of Dan Muggenborg, who was made an auxiliary in Seattle, and then he's made Bishop of Reno. And maybe there are a couple others. But yeah, I do. I mean, to me, that shows that Pope Francis has confidence in me, Anyone that would say, that Bishop Barron, he's not really a Pope Francis guy. Well, the best evidence I have to the contrary is the man has made me bishop twice. And so if he felt that I was somehow working at cross purposes, I don't think he'd make me a bishop twice. So I'll take that as a sign of confident support.
Let's talk about the shift in the 2 roles. For the last 6 years, you've been auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and now you're becoming an ordinary, the leader of a diocese. What's the difference between those 2 positions?
Well, I think it's a qualitative difference. Now, to be sure, I was ordained a bishop. You were there almost 7 years ago. Then you're every bit as much a bishop as the Pope is. I mean, you're ordained a bishop of the church, and so you're a successor of the apostles, and all of that remains the case. You're in the conference, so as an auxiliary bishop, I was a voice at the conference. I was twice elected chair of committees. I was elected to represent the bishops in Rome at a synod. So, sure, you have the full status as a bishop. Nevertheless, as I suggested, there's a qualitative difference, because as an auxiliary, my job is to give auxilium, is to give help to Archbishop Jose Gomez, who is the ordinary of this diocese. Whatever authority I have in the diocese is derived from him. It's in service of him. So I've been the regional bishop in the Santa Barbara region for the past 6 years or so. Good. I have that from his authority. I do what he wants me to do. I'm there to help implement his vision of things. When you're the ordinary, now you're the one who sets the tone and provides the vision. From a kind of real practical standpoint, the buck stops with you. So you're the one that has to make the final decisions. I put it in spiritual terms that you're the father of that diocese. So I'm a bishop of this diocese in Los Angeles, but I'm not the spiritual father of the Archdiocese. Jose Gomez is. But now in Winona, Rochester, I'm the spiritual father of the roughly 140,000 Catholics who are there, 100 parishes or so. I think that's the main difference. And, Brandon, it reminds me when I became rector at Mundelein years ago. So I'd been at Mundelein for a long time as a professor, and, I loved the students and helped them and taught them and all that. But when I became rector, it's probably like a bit like when you became a father for the first time, that something kicks in and you realize, no, I'm the spiritual father of this community, which means someone's psychologically or spiritually suffering. I'm the one that has to, deal with that. If there's a roof leaking, finally, I'm the one that's got to worry about that. If we're running out of money, I'm the one that has to, we're getting low on students, whatever it is. And even I remember this back in Chicago at Mundelein, power would go out a lot. Like during the summer, some storm would come through and the power would go out. Well, when I was a faculty member, the power's out, I've got to endure this, and I kind of put up with it, or I'd go somewhere or whatever. But when I was rector, I thought, no, I can't go anywhere. I'm responsible. I'm the one that's got to care for all these people. So I think there's something comparable now as I'm becoming ordinary of the diocese. I realize, no, I'm the spiritual father of these people. That I can't pass the buck anywhere else. Say, well, you worry about that. I have the responsibility, but also the privilege. And I think you as a father would know what I'm talking about, right? The responsibility and the privilege of being the father of this community. So that's how I see the difference.
Seems to me in that paternal role, you'd have a deeper bond with the people, even deeper than
Yeah.
you could as an auxiliary bishop, because again, you
Yeah.
have this paternal role.
Absolutely. And I think with the priest too, and you can look at it different ways, but when you're with a priest and okay, this is my spiritual father, here's the man that's going to assign me. I'll be responsible for assigning all the priests of that diocese. I'll be responsible for the, programs that are being implemented in that diocese. So that does put you in a different relationship. Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the Diocese of Winona-Rochester. I know you said earlier you were familiar with it. You knew some basics. You ticked off a couple numbers already, 140,000 Catholics, just over 100 parishes. But
Yeah.
what else should we know about it? What excites you?
Yeah, it's a long, narrow diocese. So it's the 20 counties on the southern border of Minnesota. So you're sitting right on top of Iowa. That's why I know as a Chicagoan, I'm not that far from home. So it's a long, narrow diocese. On the far eastern side, on the Mississippi River, is the town of Winona. And that was the traditional kind of see of the diocese. You go a little bit further west, you come to the city of Rochester, which is a very cool city. The Mayo Clinic is there. So arguably the finest medical center in the world is in Rochester, Minnesota. Interesting backstory, by the way, because there are Catholic nuns involved in the founding of the Mayo Clinic. It's a long, interesting story. So it makes Rochester a kind of international destination site. And it's often listed as one of the most livable cities in the country. Winona, too, is a charming city. If you approach it from the east, like from Wisconsin, and you're coming up to the Mississippi River, these beautiful bluffs open up, and Winona is built kind of on top of those bluffs. So it's lovely. It's a lovely part of the state. And then you go further west from Rochester, you come into pretty rural country. A town called Mankato. It's not too far away, but Mankato has Minnesota State University in it, which has tons of students. Winona has St. Mary's University, important place. Rochester has a campus of the University of Minnesota. So there's a lot of interesting schools, universities, places where young people gather. Rochester would have a lot of business focusing around the Mayo Clinic. You go out, it goes all the way to the border of South Dakota. So the far western end of my diocese touches like around Rapid City, South Dakota. They say it's about 4-hour drive from end to end. And I was thinking, my pastoral region here is about 3 hours end to end. If I drove from Santa Maria all the way to like Westlake Village, that'd be my whole region. It's about 3 hours. So not that much bigger, not that much longer. 140,000 Catholics, making it a kind of middle-sized diocese. Not really small. There are a lot of dioceses that are in like the 30, 40, 50, 80, 90, 100,000 range. So Winona is kind of middle of the pack when it comes to American dioceses. And then around 100 priests, I think 70 or so active, and then a number of retired priests who are still very involved. Small number of order priests, I noticed that. A lot of sisters. In fact, the Sisters of Notre Dame, I think, have a headquarters in Mankato. The Franciscans who helped to found Mayo Clinic are still in Rochester area. There are a couple of spiritual powerhouse places, contemplative convents and monasteries. Very important to me, by the way, as I begin my ministry there, is to have prayerful support from these spiritual powerhouses. Another place very interesting, right across the river, so outside my diocese, but just about, maybe a 40-minute drive, is that great shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe that Cardinal Burke built many years ago, because Burke had been bishop in La Crosse, which is right across the river from Winona. And I still haven't seen this place. I've seen photos of it. Lots of people I know have been there. I'm very eager to make a pilgrimage down there. So anyway, that's what I'm learning about the diocese. I visited with all the pastoral staff when I was up there for my announcement, met with all of them in Winona. And one thing I told them was, and I think most bishops feel this way, I don't see myself coming into the office 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. I think the bishop's job is to be really out with the people and out visiting and seeing the parishes and all that. but that I would be, a steady presence with the chancery. But that's what I know so far. That's what I'm learning.
You won't be installed until July 29th, so you haven't officially taken the reins yet, but have you already given any thought to what some of your key priorities in the diocese might be?
Yeah, I'm reluctant in a way because I want to get on the ground and see, what it's like, what the needful things are. But anyone that's been following me, and I'm sure this will come up in my homily at the installation mass, evangelization, the new evangelization, reaching out to the disaffiliated, reaching out to those who are angry at the church, who have left the church. That's obviously been a major concern of mine. I would savor the prospect of getting into some of these university centers and talking the faith. Obviously, Catholic education has been a huge priority for me. The Catholic identity of our institutions, that we don't allow a drift into secularism. And then, Brandon, I think a care for the poor. I go back to Pope Benedict. The church does the three basic things. It worships God, it evangelizes, and it cares for the poor. So what I have to find out is, who are the poor in this diocese? How are they poor? And how is the church addressing their needs? That will be, I think, a very high priority for me.
When the news broke that Pope Francis appointed you to this diocese in Minnesota, a lot of people commented on how this state, Minnesota, is becoming a powerhouse for evangelization. You have Father Mike Schmitz, who's up in Duluth, Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. You have St. Paul's Outreach, Net Ministries, both of whom have their headquarters there. One of my great loves, the Society of G.K. Chesterton, is based in the Twin Cities and the Chesterton Schools Network. What's going on here? Does that excite you that Minnesota is attracting all this evangelical activity?
And don't forget Bishop Drew Cousins up in Crookston. So he's my successor as chair of the Evangelization Committee, and he took from me the responsibility of the Eucharistic Revival, which I'm very happy to say is catching fire all over the country, and he's leading the charge on that. Also, the Catholic Studies Center at University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. So there's a lot of energy. And then Archbishop Hebda, who's the wonderful Archbishop of Minneapolis, St. Paul, he and I have been friends for a long time. And in fact, he called me up. I remember he said, well, I'm so glad you're taking over that diocese to defend our southern border against any invasion from Iowa, So now he's wonderful, and he's a got the real kind of John Paul II spirit and evangelizing sort of mind. So I'm very eager to work with him. But yeah, I think we should find a way to bring all this Minnesota energy together. I'd love to work on that.
Let's talk about one final thing. We've gotten this question a bunch at Word on Fire, as we did back in 2015 with that appointment. Namely, how does this affect your work at Word on Fire, and how will it affect your involvement with the ministry? Yeah, and I think my last 3 assignments, Brandon, I've faced that. So when I became rector at Mundelein, there were a lot of people that said, "Why are you becoming rector at Mundelein? And you're a petty administrator at this little seminary, and you have this international ministry." And I remember, that's the story I often tell, is when I was confronted just that way at a cocktail party, and I said, "There's a little man in a red cape in the next room," because Cardinal George was there, "who can answer all your questions." So ask him. Look, I didn't, we don't make these assignments. I'm not plotting my career path. These things just, happen. But we continued. So I was rector at Mundelein, and I remember that in those years, a little team would come up from our office in Skokie, and they would record sermons and commentaries. Then I became auxiliary bishop in LA. Not everybody, but some people said, "Oh my God, Word on Fire is over," Well, it was challenging. I'll give you that. Suddenly I'm, 2,000 miles away from our headquarters. I remember in those early days, you and I would do things by Zoom, but like Father Steve and others would actually fly out to LA, and we realized, well, this is not going to work very well. But we figured it out. We ended up getting different studios, now the one I'm currently in. So we'll figure it out. Now I'm being sent to Minnesota. I don't see any reason why I can't continue doing sermons, doing programs like this. We'll find some studio space, and you and I will still do this. Why I can't do commentaries? I'm still going to write a column. Most bishops do, at least once a month. I do more often than that. We'll still record those.
So, I don't run the day-to-day operations. Thank God Father Steve and Sean and others, do that. So I don't see any reason why it can't continue the same way it has now over the past, I became rector 10 years ago. It was 2012. So for the past 10 years, I've been separated from the Word on Fire office, but we've kept, in fact, not just kept it going, the ministry has grown enormously. So I don't see any difficulty there.
You've said this before. I think you said it in your press conference when this new position was announced, that you have been giving about 5 to 10% of your time to Word on Fire, and you expect that to continue. I think people just see the enormous output of Word on Fire and the reach of all of our resources and think Bishop Barron's sitting at home doing all this by himself.
No,
it's a testament to our huge and talented staff.
Yeah.
So many good young men and women who are doing this great work with you.
No, quite right. That's part of the story, is that the staff is so good and so much of the, pragmatic work is done. But also, Brandon, I think we've all been pretty clever about how we do this. So I put out a number of books since I've been out here. Pre-COVID, a lot of those books were compilations of essays, or they're, let's say the scripts I did for the pivotal players. Now that they were written over many, many years, and finally we brought them together. Just came out with a book, Redeeming the Time, which is my columns from the past several years. So what we're doing there is combining things and trying to approach it in a clever way. Then, COVID happened. And COVID was a terrible thing, but it also opened a couple of doors. And one of those that opened for me was more time for research and writing. And so I wrote my book on the Creed, Light from Light. And I did a fair amount of the Bible commentary during COVID. So, we've done what we can. And when opportunities arise, we take them. So I don't make any apologies for that. I think I did my work out here very competently. And, I got around this big region, spent a lot of time in automobiles, going to meetings and liturgies and confirmations, and managed to keep, my involvement with Word on Fire up. So we'll do the same thing. We'll do the same thing in Minnesota.
So allow that to be on the record to clear up any concerns or confusions. Bishop Barron is not stepping back from Word on Fire. Word on Fire will continue to grow and flourish and do amazing things.
As we have for the past 10 years.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have a question from Meg. She's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and she's asking Bishop Barron what it's like to act in persona Christi as priests do during the Mass. Here's her question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Meg from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I was wondering if you could describe what it's like to be in persona Christi from a physical and emotional perspective. Thank you very much. God bless.
Yeah, thank you. It's a cool question, because you're right. As a priest, I'm operating at Mass not in my own person. It's not Robert Barron sharing his private views, right? I'm operating, we say, in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. That my gestures, my words, especially the words of consecration, are the words of Jesus. And therefore, it's by his authority that the Eucharistic change is effected, etc. When I preach, it shouldn't be Robert Barron's private ideas about religion coming out, but rather the mind of Christ as reflected in the Scriptures. So that's a very important, I call it metaphysical and spiritual truth. Now, you asked about the physical and psychological level. Am I trying to impersonate Jesus? No. Am I trying to move into what I think was his emotional state at the Last Supper? No. As I record these words, I just said Mass about an hour ago, and I wasn't moving into that psychological space of Jesus at the Last Supper. I'm assuming the integrity of this identity of mine, which came through ordination. Now, having said that, are there times when you're saying Mass that you become so kind of acutely and specially aware of this relationship that you do feel it, so to speak, that it becomes almost like a physical reality? And I think yes. And when that happens, great. great, but I wouldn't cling to it, or I wouldn't see that as central to it. What's central is this new identity that I received at ordination. And out of that metaphysical, spiritual identity, I do what I do at Mass and the other sacraments.
Well, thank you so much, Meg, for that question. And thanks to all of you for listening. I forgot to mention, if you have a question that you'd like to send in to Bishop Barron, you can do so at the website, askbishopbarron.com. We've talked a lot about books recently, and we have another great book coming out from Word on Fire. Today is the launch day for a new book by Dr. Holly Ordway titled Tales of Faith, a Guide for Leading with Beauty. The book asks the question, how can we share the gospel and make disciples in our modern culture? Many people are walking away from the faith, as we know, or they've never had the faith presented to them in a compelling manner. However, literature and the arts can often be a way in. This is something Bishop Barron has proposed for years. In her new book, Tales of Faith, Holly Ordway shows how literature can foster fruitful discussions that allow us to meet people where they are and help them move them closer to Christ. She covers books such as the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Divine Comedy, much more. If you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a lover of classical literature, this will be an invaluable resource for you. So again, it's titled Tales of Faith, new book from Word on Fire. I'll include a link to it in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening.
Practice both in a very enthusiastic way. That people in one group are also involved in the other and vice versa.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. Many Catholics are concerned with the liturgy, while many others are concerned with social justice. And they're often at odds with each other. So how can we bridge this divide? That's what we'll be discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us from his diocese of Winona, Rochester. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to see you.
I got to see you in person a few times, actually, within the
past
couple weeks.
In three different states.
That's right, in Florida and Minnesota, but then the other one was
Texas.
in Texas. And that's what I wanted to talk with you about. About half of the Word on Fire team traveled to Texas to put on the first inaugural Wonder Conference. This was a conference focusing on faith and science. It will be the first of an annual series. So we've already started working on the 2023 edition of the conference, 2024, I believe. But tell us, how'd that Wonder Conference go from your perspective?
I loved it. As part of the Templeton grant, we got this grant some years ago to do a number of things, and one was to have a national conference. And we invited some marvelous people, the great Father Spitzer, who's done wonderful work on religion and science, Karen Oberg, who's from Harvard University. I ran into her in Rome in September when I was there at the Pontifical Council for the Sciences. I gave a talk on faith, science, religion, philosophy, all that. I loved it. We had well over 1,000 people, and we sold out very quickly. And wonderful kind of buzz from the community, great interest in the talks, I thought. So the whole thing was wonderful.
I want to encourage people, if you weren't able to attend in person, we did record all of the talks, and they're available inside of the Word on Fire Institute. So if you've been waiting for a while to join, now is as good a time as any, because you not only get access to all the courses, the films, you get the Evangelization and Culture Journal that we produce, but you also get access to all of these talks from the Wonder Conference. So learn more, sign up at wordonfire.institute. That's the website. All right, let's talk about the liturgy and social justice, Bishop. Most observant Catholics are aware that there are several camps within the broader church. Some Catholics focus primarily on prayer and spirituality. Others focus on service to the poor and the homeless. Some participate in pro-life work, and others on immigration, racism, the environment. Now, many times these camps are held in tension with one another. You have groups opposing one another, getting angry at one another, fueling animosity, but perhaps none more so than these two groups, people concerned with the liturgy and people concerned with social justice. So maybe we'll start by asking you, Has this always been your experience throughout your life? Have you always seen tension in these two camps, or is it more of a recent phenomenon?
No, I would say most of my lifetime, because I come of age right after Vatican II, and I think the split between the two happened in the years after the council. Like a lot of negative things, frankly, not because of the council, but in the wake of the council, that divide. So there are some people that are, fussing around in sanctuaries and with cassocks and surplices and candles and all that, and then other people out there on the street serving the poor. And they often would fall into opposing, as you say, camps. And I think that was in some ways, it's a bitter fruit of that time. Because I want to argue prior to the council, and indeed in the text of the council, the coming together of those two things is what's emphasized. And I think the loss of that has been a real negative in the life of the church. So I'd say, most of my lifetime I've seen that tension. Can I say something before I forget, Brandon, too? As you mentioned at the outset, these different, areas of interest. Well, nothing wrong with that. The people by nature, by background, by personality, by predilection will tend in one direction or the other. So a lot of my life in the church was spent in academia with books and ideas and teaching and writing and preaching, and fine. That's what I was, interested in. I was good at it, so I did it. Other people will gravitate in different directions. Fine. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, let all these different forms of life flourish within the church. The danger is when we start saying, okay, I've got it. I've got the right way to do it, and you should, you're not doing it right. So there's a legitimate pluralism in the way that we live our lives within the church. That goes back to the Pauline letters. That some are apostles, some are prophets, some are teachers, some are administrators. Fine, that's good and healthy. The warfare is not healthy.
It's easy just to give lip service to solving these tensions and just to tell these camps, hey, can we all just get along? We're all on the same team. We're all Catholic. But I thought for this episode, in order to chart a helpful way forward, that we could look at a few key figures who in their very person burst this false dichotomy, who were deeply passionate about both the liturgy and the social doctrine of the church. And the first one I want to talk about is a figure who's very important to you. I think people listening to you over the years have heard his name many, many times, but we've never done a dedicated feature about him. So let's do it now. His name is Monsignor Reinhold Hillenbrand, not to be confused with Dietrich von Hildebrand,
right.
But Reinhold von Hillenbrand. He was a figure in the early 20th century, someone who was involved in both the liturgical movement and social justice. Tell us a little bit about him and specifically how he linked these two dimensions of the church.
Yeah, a fascinating figure. As you say, a hero of mine. When I was rector at Mundelein, I had a portrait of him up in my office because he was my predecessor as rector of Mundelein Seminary. He was back in the 30s and early 1940s. Hillenbrand was a Chicago priest. The name gives away his German ethnic background, and that gave him a natural entree into both liturgy and all the reform movements before the council, because a lot of German thinkers were key there. Goes to Mundelein Seminary, and brilliant man, eventually sent to Europe for further studies. And then as a very young man, I think he was 31, he became rector of the seminary. So Cardinal Mundelein would have noticed his great gifts and put him there. In that capacity, he trained a generation of Chicago priests who sort of carried his vision forward and who still have influence. And I think we'll get back to this, but one of his students, Monsignor Bill Quinn, was a great mentor to me. So I would see myself spiritually as a kind of grandson of Reinhold Hillenbrand. What were his great themes? I would say what you're talking about. The coming together of a passion for the liturgy of the church and for the social action work of the church. Hillenbrand saw the one flowing from the other, each returning to the other, each being fed and informed by the other. What happens around the altar has implications for our commitment to love within the wider society. What we experience in our work for justice returns now to the altar and is offered as a sacrifice to God. Now he was getting all that from the great liturgical movement leaders, people like Romano Guardini in Europe, Virgil Michael in our country, or Virgil Michael rather is from our country, from Collegeville, Karl Adam over in Germany. Those were the figures that impacted Hillenbrand, who then impacted a whole generation, not just of Chicago priests, but through the liturgical movement in our country, a whole generation of priests all over America. Maybe we'll get there next, but after Vatican II, his life took an interesting turn. And that's one reason why I think he's not as well known as he should be.
We'll say more about that. So Hillenbrand is this bridge figure who was active before and after the council in many ways.
Yeah.
But what happened? What shifted during that period?
Well, from his perspective, nothing significant shifted. But from the perspective of others, something did. Here's what I'm talking about. In the 30s and 40s, he would have identified himself as a papal man because the popes, think of Quadragesimo Anno and think of Mater et Magistra of John the 23rd, think of the great social teaching encyclicals. That's what inspired him. It was the papal teaching of that period that was very strong on the works of justice. Now, after the council, 1968, this famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, encyclical of Pope Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, about contraception, which divided the church, still is a polarizing document. You got me, not Dietrich von Hildebrand, Reinhold Hillenbrand supported it. And a lot of his followers, people that were very influenced by him and inspired by him in the 1940s, broke with him and thought, the old man's lost it. That he's become an arch conservative. And Hillenbrand's answer was, no, I was a papal man in the 40s. I'm a papal man in the 60s. And in fact, there's a link between the great social justice insistence back in the 40s and the teaching of Humanae Vitae. And so he paid a high price because Humanae Vitae comes out, 68? I think Hillenbrand dies in 78 or 79. The last, so roughly 10 years of his life, he was kind of a marginalized figure. Even his followers thought he was suspicious. And he died, I think, a bit under the cloud of that. But I see him now as a hero, as a model of how we can think through these things together in a very integrated way.
One of the ways that he did think through these things together is through the concept of deification, which was maybe the single most important idea in his writings and thought. Talk about that.
Maybe I've told this story, Brandon, on our show. I don't remember, but someone who was very much part of that movement, liturgical movement, all that back in the 40s and 50s, was Godfrey Diekmann, another German name. Godfrey was a monk at St. John's, Collegeville, not far from where I'm broadcasting these words. And, marvelous figure. He taught the church fathers for many years, and he was at Vatican II. He was influential in the writing of some of the documents. And I met him when he was a very old man through a mutual friend. We'll get to him, Monsignor Bill Quinn, who was a student of Hillenbrand. Well, anyway, I meet him as a very old man, and he marvelous storyteller and knew everybody, so I was fascinated by him. And I said to him, Godfrey, if you were young again and you could mount the barricades, what would you fight for in the life of the church? And he brought his cane. He was an old man. He was in his 90s. Brought the cane down on my knee, and he said, deification. And that's the idea that Reinhold Hillenbrand found so compelling. And they all got it from the liturgical movement people in the early 20th century. This is the mystical body theology that says the ordinary goal of the Christian life is what Aquinas called deificatio, becoming conformed to the divine nature, not just being a good person or not just being ethically upright, but being conformed to God's nature. How's it happen? It happens in the liturgy. It happens in the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist. Now, what do deified people do? They go out and live in the world in this radically transformative way. See, so that's why deification is a central idea that links liturgy and justice. Well, it was wonderful. I think of it now. Godfrey has gone to the Lord, of course. And I was there with Bill Quinn at the time, these two kind of venerable figures, both of whom would have known Hillenbrand very well. And I was a young guy at the time. I was probably 27. I was a newly ordained priest. But it linked me to that great tradition. And anyone that's followed me as I'm talking through these things, what are you hearing? What I've been teaching now for the past 25 years in my books and articles and these videos and so on, is I was caught up in that wonderful vision. You know who else was? Josef Ratzinger. You know who else was? Karl Wojtyła. You know who else was? Hans-Urs von Balthasar. You know who else was? Dietrich von Hildebrand, if you want. All those people were part of this grand movement. And I think, maybe we'll get there, Brandon, but it's threatened from both sides today. It's threatened from the left and from the right. But I think it's the richest way to articulate the teaching and the practice of the church.
This theological movement with some of the figures you just mentioned, Balthasar, Hildebrand, Ratzinger, Wojtyła, we could also add de Lubac, Guardini to that mix. They're characterized by the communio school.
Yeah.
I want to ask specifically about the communio ecclesiology, the communio way of understanding the church, and how that itself can be a link between the liturgy and justice, the social action of the church.
Yeah, the deepest ground of a communio ecclesiology, of course, is the communio of the divine persons. So the three persons of the Trinity exist in this perichoresis, the Greeks call it, this sort of sitting together, the circumensessio, if you put it in Latin. But it's the communio, the one in the other, of the Trinitarian persons that becomes the foundation of ecclesial life, because we've been invited, deification, into a share in that communio. Furthermore, it manifests itself in the communio of the church. So think of all the different elements in the life of the church, the different ranks and orders and different ways of participating in the mystical body, all of which are on display in the liturgy. Let me say a word about that, because I remember Cardinal George, again, someone very much influenced by this whole tradition. He used to say, the trouble is we read the liturgy in its variegated expression through Nietzschean lenses. So right away we say, oh, power relationship, who's on top, who's bossing people around, and how come I don't get up there to that position? Where he said, don't read it through Nietzschean lens, read it through this communio lens, is the church is on its integrated, mutually implicative display at the liturgy. Cardinal George, again, he would chide priests who would sometimes, so I'll come to the liturgy, but if I'm not saying the Mass, I'm just going to sit in the back in my civilian clothes, And he would say, no. The priest always appears at the liturgy as head, because that's your job as priest. Now, don't read it in a Nietzschean way, like, I'm here to boss you all around. It means the symbolic display appropriate to a priest at the liturgy is as the head of the community. But look, everybody at the liturgy, everyone is displaying his or her proper role in the mystical body. And mystical body theology, all the different elements that make up your body, okay, they all have a wonderful function. They're all integrated one with the others. That's the sort of organic understanding of the church that's part of communio. Do you want to do another step? We could do a show on this sometime. Go back to the Tübingen school, back early 19th century. Someone like Johann Adam Müller, who's one of my theological heroes. He dies at the age of 42, young man, but had a huge impact. He shifted from a more juridical understanding of church to a more organic understanding of church. Read him and now read Guardini, early 20th century, and then read Sacrosanctum Concilium, read Lumen Gentium. There's a direct line from the Tübingen thought of like Johann Adam Müller right through Guardini and people like Reinhold Hillenbrand and others right up to Vatican II. That's the tradition that I'm standing in. And it's all conditioned by a communio sensibility.
I love how a few moments ago you described the purpose of the Mass as deification. We go to Mass to become conformed to the likeness of Christ, and that in turn propels us out into the social mission of the church.
Right.
I think of two people that are very important to me, and I know to you as well, Mother Teresa and Pier Giorgio Frassati. Both of them demonstrated this same pattern of being people deeply devoted to the liturgy and especially to the Eucharist. So Mother Teresa and her sisters have daily Mass, daily holy hour of adoration before they do their social work. Same with Pier Giorgio, adoration, sacraments all the time. But it was going to the sacraments that, for them, helped them to see Christ in the poor. To me, that's always been the most important link. That the seeing Christ in the Blessed Sacrament enables you to more effectively see and serve Him in the poor.
Right, that's the instinct. And see, if you have let's say, all the liturgical stuff and benedictions and blessed sacrament, adoration, all that, without a commitment to changing and transfiguring the world, religion becomes more of an abstraction. If you've got the caring for the world without the connection to the liturgical, it devolves into social action. You're a social justice warrior, you're secularized. The great figures, and every one that we mentioned, I'll give you another one, by the way, Fulton J. Sheen. Read Sheen's early work, I love it, on ecclesiology. It's filled with this perspective. I learned it from him, probably. It's the first time I read all this stuff. But when you have both, now we're cooking. When you have both, you have a properly integrated vision. And the one will feed the other. It's like you set up this wonderful, mutually energizing connection between the two. And that's what, talk about Dorothy Day, someone else that knew that in her bones.
I do want to get to Dorothy Day, another hero of both of ours, but there's one person I want to talk about before that. His name is one you just mentioned a few moments ago, Monsignor Bill Quinn. So Monsignor Quinn was the link between you and Hillenbrand. Monsignor Quinn, I think, passed away in 2004, and you said at the time that except for your father, he was the greatest man you've ever known. He, in many ways, was shaped and marked by both the liturgy and the social concerns of the church. Tell us a little bit about Monsignor Quinn.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. He's not a household name, but in Chicago he would be, and a lot of the people I mentioned, at least on this side of the Atlantic, back in the day would have known Monsignor Quinn. I'll set it up this way. I'm 26 years old. I'm newly ordained priest. I'm sent to St. Paul the Cross Parish in Park Ridge, Illinois. If you've flown into O'Hare, you've flown right over it, right? And living at the rectory at the time was a newly retired priest named Bill Quinn, 70 years old, newly retired, and he was living in the rectory. So I'd run into him. I didn't know who he was from Adam. And we'd start talking, and he was wonderful, friendly and fascinating. And then he'd drop a name. I say, oh, did you know him? Oh, yeah. How'd you know him? Well, I think it was at Vatican II. You were at Vatican II? Yeah, I was living right down the hall from John Courtney Murray. John Courtney Murray? He said, yeah, I remember he was clacking away at his typewriter when he was writing Dignitatis Humanae. You were there when he was writing. It was that kind of a thing where he would just kind of gradually unveil, his rather remarkable career. Well, as I mentioned, I think, a few minutes ago, Bill, ordained 1940, was one of the students of Reinhold Hillenbrand, along with a whole coterie of Chicago priests. And he followed Hillenbrand faithfully. He would have been a Hillenbrand man. They called them Hilly's boys back in the day, these young priests that kind of followed Hillenbrand's. And what he got from him was so much. He got the artistic tradition of the church. Bill loved Chartres Cathedral. They got the intellectual tradition. He loved Aquinas and the church fathers. And he got the liturgical tradition, and he got the social justice tradition. All of it wrapped together in a very coherent package. Bill would have been thoroughly pre-Vatican II. I mean, born, I don't know what year, born in the 20s or late teens or something, ordained 1940. So the first 25 years of his priesthood is all pre-conciliar. But then he got the council. I mean, he understood, not the kind of kooky, crazy season after the council, but he understood where the council was coming from and saw that it embodied a lot of these themes. Well, it's one of the great graces of my life, really, that I was, because I didn't know him from Adam, but I think, God knew who he was. And God sent me there as this young, impressionable kid, but interested in all these things. And here was this great sort of guru figure, like a master figure. And Bill had a big impact on me. So a lot of my taking in of the tradition I've been describing came through his mediation.
Am I right in remembering that he also was very active in racial reconciliation work?
Yeah, he was pastor of a parish called St. Eulalia, still in Chicago. It's right off the Eisenhower Expressway. And so Bill would be pastor right when it was undergoing a sort of integration. So a lot of white folks were moving out, the Black and Hispanic folks are moving in. And Bill was a marvelous link. He was a marvelous figure that would bring these different groups together. He knew Cesar Chavez very well, by the way. In fact, Chavez, I think it was, did a reading at Bill's 25th anniversary mass. He knew Gustavo Gutierrez. He knew the liberation theologian people, from back in the 60s and 70s. Now, there we can keep the conversation going if you want. Were there parts of this tradition that kind of started getting unraveled? So as I mentioned liberation theology, I would share a lot of, let's say, Ratzinger's concerns about liberation theology. Did it begin with a good instinct but maybe get unraveled a bit? Okay, we can talk about that. But Bill, I think, would have taken in a lot of this beautifully integrated vision that we've been talking about. He knew Dorothy Day, too, by the way. He would have been in touch with her.
Well, let's move on. It's funny how all of these figures seem linked. You mentioned Cesar Chavez as well, who was also a friend of Dorothy Day. And that's where I wanted to go next, is to maybe wrap up this discussion with Dorothy, because to me, she stands out above and beyond all the figures of the 20th century as the preeminent example of the linking of the liturgical life of the church and the social action. She was arguably the loudest advocate for justice and peace, at least in the English-speaking world during the 20th century. Yet she was also very devoted and considerate of the liturgy. As a young woman, when she was being drawn from communism into Catholicism, and her social work was already in high gear at that point, it was the liturgy that began to captivate her. In fact, she describes this early experience of attending Mass and being impressed at how the rich and the poor were kneeling side by side in prayer. And she observed that this mixed community of rich and poor in the harsh world of 1930s America was something that you could hardly find anywhere else, yet it strangely existed there around the altar of Christ. Yeah. Why do you think this left such a deep impact on Dorothy Day, and how did it shape the rest of her work?
Well, as you say, that was the way in, I think, as she was, if you want to understand Dorothy Day, go get it's a marvelous movie called Reds, and it's about Jack Reed, who was a social activist, revolutionary in the 1910s and into the 1920s. Eugene O'Neill was part of that group. These Greenwich Village intellectuals, radicals, Max Eastman, for example, another one. Dorothy Day was part of that world. So she would have been, let's say, a 20-year-old in 1917, when Jack Reed is talking about the Russian Revolution, World War I's going on, all the social activism around that. So she was in that world. But then for a lot of reasons, you and I, both know how compelling that story is. We can't tell the whole thing now, but she began to open her heart to something deeper, a spiritual dimension of life. And then she tried to find a way to link these two things together, her great commitment to justice and to the poor, and her newly found faith. And the transition moment, I think, was the liturgy, when she'd go to Mass. And as you say, she'd notice not a segregated world, but the very richest, the very poorest, the establishment types, the new immigrants, very well educated, very poorly educated, but all kneeling together, all looking toward the same thing together. The mystical body on display. That's what struck her, I think. Then the rest of her life, you might say, was an attempt, and Peter Morin, who was the co-founder with her of the Catholic Worker Movement, played a huge role. By the way, there's another name if you want to put in our sort of Hall of Fame of these people. Read Peter Morin. He's all over this. Liturgical movement meets social justice, meets the mystical body. Peter Morin's another one. And Dorothy Day would have been schooled by him in this vision. But she beautifully exemplifies it, as you say. It's not just a theory, but she lived it. I don't know anyone in the Catholic world who was more radically committed to justice and the poor than Dorothy Day. And, I mean, with the exception maybe of a Trappist hermit or something, someone more dedicated to prayer, benediction, retreat, Mass, 40 hours, rosary, than Dorothy Day. She did both. And there she is indeed like Mother Teresa. That famous photo, we've all seen it now, when Mother Teresa met Dorothy Day. And Dorothy especially was very elderly at the time. Mother Teresa was probably in her 60s or something. And Mother Teresa has the habit on, and Dorothy Day is kind of like an old lady dress on. And there they are, these two great figures who embodied everything that we're talking about.
It's sometimes supposed that those who care about the social mission of the church are apathetic about the liturgy. But there's a Dorothy Day story that I really like, which belies this assumption. On one occasion, there was a priest who was celebrating Mass at one of her Catholic worker houses, and this is, I'm guessing, post Vatican II,
Yeah,
crazy
probably.
time, or maybe shortly before it, but he decided to use a ceramic coffee mug for the chalice and then
Yeah.
this plain old plate as the paten. And Dorothy, by accounts, grimaced when she saw the vessels, but she didn't complain. She indeed took part in the liturgy, received communion, and afterward even expressed gratitude to the priest for celebrating Mass. But then when everyone had gone, she took the cup and the plate and she had them buried outside. And she told the others that having held the body and blood of Christ, that the vessels should no longer be used for coffee. What do you think that story speaks in
It's so
regards to
good.
this conversation?
And I remember that before she buried the cup, she had it broken. She broke it into pieces, and it just as kind of a sign of reverence, and that this could never return to profane usage. Yeah, to me that speaks volumes. 'Cause I'm sure the priest thought he was being very cool and very post-conciliar, and I'm kind of with the people, but she didn't buy that because that was a divorce then between the two dimensions. That was a lack of respect to the real presence. But without the real presence, then you don't have the church's authentic social commitment. It's from the liturgy that it comes. And so if you're flippant or blasé about the liturgy, then you will soon become just a secular social activist. To be honest, Brandon, that's what some people are concerned about with some of the Catholic worker houses, around the country, that they've lost some of Dorothy's intense spiritual commitment and can devolve. I shouldn't speak because I don't really know everyone, of course, but can devolve in that direction. She did not have that problem.
Let's close with this question. As a Catholic bishop, what's the path moving forward in these two areas? To use the title of one of your books, how do we bridge the great divide between the liturgy and social justice?
Deification. So I got Godfrey Diekman's cane. I can feel it come down on my knee right now. Deification, a recovery of the mystical body theology. Once you get that, you will automatically get both sides of it. Also, I would encourage communities, parishes, that practice both in a very enthusiastic way. That people in one group are also involved in the other and vice versa. So if the pastor of a parish in his role as shepherd should make sure those two groups are in contact with each other. But the key is the mystical body theology. It's deification.
Reminds me when you give your talks on faith and science and you say, can I have all the science teachers stand up and all the theology teachers stand up? Now you guys talk to each other. It's
Absolutely.
like, can we have all the liturgy people up and all the social justice people and you guys talk to each other?
Yeah, and stop caricaturing. We do that all the time. So the social justice types will look at the liturgical people. Oh, there they are fussing around with their cassocks. And then the liturgical people, oh, look at those Marxist secularists over there. No, the link is the Eucharist and the mystical body.
Well, now it's time for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have one from Susan in New York. She's asking about an argument that persuaded Bishop Barron as a young man and set him on a new course of life. So here's Susan's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Susan from New York. You mentioned in a recent homily that you were very persuaded about the existence of God when you were a freshman in high school. Can you please repeat that argument for us?
Yeah, thank you. It's the first way of Thomas Aquinas, the argument from motion. You want the quick version. Some things change. Whatever is changed by another. There can be no infinite regress in changed changers. Therefore, there must be some first unchanged changer, and this all people call God. That would be a very schematic presentation of the argument. It begins with this very ordinary experience of things changing. Thomas calls it motus, or motion, but doesn't mean just physical motion or change of place. He means any kind of change. Well, nothing changes itself. It can't change. It can't move itself from potency to act. It has to be actualized by something external. But then I can't have an infinite regress of moved movers. There's got to be a first uncaused cause or first unmoved mover. So it's a argument that's part of a whole family of arguments that are like that, argument for a first instance. Anyway, it struck me when I was a kid. It struck me when I first heard that as very compelling and interesting, and set me on this path of discovery that I've never left. And I spent a lot of my life, writing about that argument, teaching it, defending it. So it played a big role in my life.
Susan, if you'd like a more detailed elaboration of the argument, check out Bishop's book on Thomas Aquinas, but also the work of Edward Fazer. He has a great book called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, that goes through each of the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. Well, as we wrap up today, I am excited to announce not just the newest book at Word on Fire, but the newest series of books at Word on Fire. Look at this big boxed set from those of you watching on YouTube. This is a 4-volume series of books by Peter Kraft titled Socrates' Children, An Introduction to Philosophy from the 100 Greatest Philosophers. Peter Kraft, the esteemed philosophy professor, author of over 80 books, has taught college philosophy for 60 years. And throughout those decades, he said he yearned for a beginner's philosophy text that was clear, accessible, enjoyable, and exciting, perhaps even funny. And finding none that met those criteria, he decided to write it himself, as Peter is wont to do. In this 4-volume set, he delivers with his characteristic wit and clarity an introduction to philosophy. So if you've always wanted to learn philosophy, this is a great way in. It examines the key ideas and players in 4 major eras: ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary, and immerses readers in the great conversation, the ongoing dialogue among the greatest thinkers of history. So check it out. It's the most exciting new release from Word on Fire. Again, it's called Socrates' Children, An Introduction to Philosophy from the 100 Greatest Philosophers. And as always, I will include a link in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.